How many of you here today have ever been on a diet? Put your hands up. Quite a few. That's not really surprising. We're very aware of what we eat, aren't we? We read books, we read labels, we make eating plans, we buy organic, fair range, gluten-free, GMO-free, 100-mile diet. And when we fall off the wagon from our latest eating plan, we feel guilty about it. Why? Because we know the importance of what we put into our bodies. Our food is our fuel. And we know that poor fuel can lead to poor performance. But there's another type of fuel that we run on: information. Knowing what's happening in our world, in our community, in our country is critical to being an informed citizen. From knowing what route to take to get to school or to work in the morning on time, to knowing what is happening at your city council that's going to change what's happening on your street or change your tax bill, to knowing if someone might start a war today with a tweet. And isn't it scary that we can actually say that seriously? We need information to function. We need to feed our bodies as well as our minds. But it seems to me that we pay a lot more attention to what we're putting into our mouths than what we're putting into our eyes and ears. So today, I'd like to challenge you to think about your news the way you think about your food. More specifically, where it comes from and how it gets to you. Because if we don't do that, we might not have local news for much longer. So let's start with where it comes from. If you read news this morning, where did you probably read it? One of these, right? Or maybe on your computer. But when we say, I get my news from the internet, that's kind of like saying, my food comes from the grocery store. It's technically true, but it doesn't address how the food is made, who makes it, or where it really comes from, just the last mile of how it gets to you. We could dig a little deeper into that. We could say, I get my news from Facebook. That's great. That's all well and good. How many of the stories that you read on Facebook today were written by people at Facebook? None. Facebook is a platform for sharing information that other people have gathered. It's where everyone from your Aunt Sally up to the New York Times is competing for your attention in that news feed. And how do they get there? Through a complicated algorithm devised by Facebook that looks at what you've been reading lately and commenting on, what your friends are looking at and interacting with, what people you've never met before but are kind of like you are reading and sharing, and, of course, what Facebook is being paid to put in front of you. So in the end, if that's where you're getting your news from, that's your diet, that's kind of like getting your groceries for the week at a convenience store, isn't it? You'll certainly get enough food to feed you. You might get a few healthy things along the way, but I think in the end, you're going to be eating an awful lot of junk food. Now, a lot of what we're talking about here today falls under the umbrella of media literacy, which has been getting a lot more attention over the last few years. But I'm not here today to talk about the perils of fake news or filter bubbles or how social media only shows you things that reinforce what you already believe. These are really important topics, but before we can even go there, we have to talk about how the sausage is made, how your news is made, how it gets to you, who pays for it. Because we are actually near a point where there may not be local news in many communities soon. And by the time we realize that, it could be too late. That's because the way the news is paid for, the business model behind it, has radically changed in just a few short years. Let's look at what the business model used to look like. Still does to a degree today. Here it is. It's a newspaper. You read stories, and you pay for the news with your attention. The advertising around there. Advertisers pay to put their content next to news. This is the way that radio and TV and free circulation newspapers operate. It's also, by the way that paid circulation newspapers operate. When you buy the Globe and Mail at your convenience store or you pay to have the New York Times delivered to your house, you're not paying for the news. You're paying maybe 15 to 20% of what it actually costs to create that content, to gather it, and to get it to your doorstep. It's subsidized. So let's look at the new model today. Looks kind of similar, doesn't it? There's content, there's advertising surrounding it. The difference is that most of the money that's going to the advertising here isn't going to the people that create the content. Let's look a little closer. See this ad? That's the one in the top right corner. And see in the corner of that ad that there's a little triangle. That means that this ad was placed on this website by a program called AdSense that Google runs. It's a huge program. Millions of websites, from personal blogs up to major media outlets, participate to make money off of their websites. In the second between me clicking on this page and this page loading, there was an auction. And this company won the right to show me that ad. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is growing every single year. But there's also billions on billions of page views available online. And that's growing even faster. So when the laws of supply and demand kick in, how much do you think this advertiser paid to show me this ad? 2 cents? Actually, not that much. 1 cent? Still too high. That's about right. 4/10 of 1 penny for that ad. And remember, this is being hosted by Google, so 3/10 of that are going to Google, leaving 1/10 of 1 cent that goes to the company that paid the reporter to write that story and that hosted that web page. This is the problem right here. There are billions of dollars going into online advertising, more every year, while the amount that goes into traditional advertising declines. But the vast majority of it, 84% of all online ad revenue in the world last year outside of China, went to 2 companies which don't create any content. Would you care to take a guess as to who they might be? One starts with an F, the other starts with a G. That's right. And what's left over is being shared by millions of websites, some of which are news sites, and some of which are massive media platforms that get a great amount of that attention. So when you get down to the local level, here in Kamloops, or Merritt, or Lillooet, you're talking about an ever-increasing supply of putting up content. The prices are going down. You're talking about fractions of fractions of fractions of pennies that are going to local news. And that just isn't going to be enough to keep the doors open and pay reporters for that much longer. But maybe this is just growing pains, right? Maybe there is a new online ad model for news, and we just need the old legacy media, the newspapers and the radio stations and the TV stations, to just die off and get out of the way so we can make this model work. Okay, let's test that. Let's do a little bit of media math here today. Let's say we're going to create an online-only news website for our small town, and we're going to pay for it with online ads. Here it is. We'll call it the Podunk Post. Let's make a budget for it. Let's say we're going to have 5 people. We're going to have 3 reporters. We're going to have 1 person who sells the ads. We're going to have an editor who's in charge of the operation. We're going to need to host our website and maintain it. We're going to need an office for these people to work in. They'll need phones. They'll need internet access. We'll need to buy them donuts once in a while. I like buying donuts for my staff. So that website, that 5 people, is going to cost us about $300,000 a year. If we pay them decently, we pay those people about $50,000 a year each, benefits in, let's say. So let's do that. And let's also say, before we figure out the math, let's say that our web salesperson, she's really good, and that 1/10 of a penny per ad we were getting, she manages to get that all the way up to half a penny per ad, and we're going to put 4 ads on every page of our website without it looking too cluttered. So now we are up to the princely sum of 2 cents every time someone clicks on a page on our website. So let's do that math. $300,000 a year and 2 cents per page view. How many page views a year are we going to need to run that website to break even? 15 million a year. Sounds pretty steep, doesn't it? Is it even possible? Actually, I can tell you that if it's possible or not, because in my job, I get to see the web traffic for 80 different community newspaper websites across Western Canada, from little tiny places in prairies to metro newspapers in major communities. Do you know how many of those 80 newspapers get this much traffic per year? 1. And it's got a lot more than 3 reporters, actually. This is the problem that we face. It seems like that there's an infinite amount of advertising available, and there's plenty of money to pay for local content, but the money isn't going to the creators of that advertising content. So how are they still surviving in this model? Mainly, to be honest, because we're actually being subsidized. There are newspaper owners. This is going to sound strange because we're used to hearing about money-grubbing billionaires who run the media. But I actually know some of the people who run community news sites, and they actually keep money-losing newspapers open with the money that they actually get from money-making newspapers because they believe in serving their local communities. But this can't last forever. Already, in the last 5 years in Canada, there have been dozens of media outlets that have had to close, and hundreds of local journalists have lost their jobs. I know. I had to see it happen here in Kamloops. See this? That's the last front page of the Kamloops Daily News from 4 years ago. I'm in the front row, third from the end. I never want to be on a front page like this again, and I don't want to see any more front pages like this anywhere else. We live in an era where there seems to be an infinite amount of news available and plenty of ads to pay for it all. But because the business model is broken, because the money is going to the middlemen, we actually stand at the brink of a drought in local news at what looks like a time of plenty. Imagine, going back to that food analogy, imagine going into a supermarket and seeing nothing but empty shelves. Or worse, shelves full of nothing but junk food with empty calories. This is what we're facing. So what's the solution? A big part of it is acknowledging that there is a problem. We in the media don't like to do that because we are still trying to make money off the old ad model while we transition to the new one. And we don't want to undermine our advertisers' confidence in that. But we need to get the message out. We need to take the bull by the horns and explain how this sausage is made and why the business model isn't working. We need to do that because the next step, you may not like this, sorry, is we're going to have to ask you, the reader, to start paying. Not with your attention, but with your wallets. It'd be nice to say that Google and Facebook are going to see what they're doing and start giving money for local news, but I really don't like the odds of that. Even if they did, they're going to cover big communities. Is Lillooet Town Council going to see a reporter from Google or Facebook? Never. Not Merritt, maybe not even the size of Kamloops. If we want local news, and I think we do, we are going to have to pay for it. Now, in some places, we already do pay for it. How many of you are familiar with this? The dreaded paywall. How many of you know how to get past one of these paywalls? Don't answer. It'll make me feel bad. The fact is, though, that this, I think, is a flawed model for local news because news is a public good. Everyone needs access to it, whether they can afford to pay for it or not. That means we need to explore a philanthropic, voluntary contribution model that allows those who can afford to pay to support local news to do so voluntarily, and thereby allowing everyone to have access to it, whether they can afford it or not. This isn't an alien concept either. This is happening in Canada at the TIE, at the Canada Land Podcast Network. It's happening at The Guardian in the UK. And if government were to, say, make those contributions to local media outlets tax deductible, the way they are for charities or for political parties, That could be a sustainable source of funding for local news that doesn't depend on advertising. There's another thing that governments can do, by the way, is just level the playing field. Did you know that if you buy an ad on a community news website in Canada, you pay GST, as you should? If you buy that same ad on Google or Facebook or LinkedIn, you don't have to pay the tax because they're not Canadian-owned companies. It's a loophole in the Income Tax Act. And if governments just closed that loophole, took a portion of the money for that, and put it towards supporting local news, that could be hundreds of millions of dollars a year right there. The theme today is growing through our truths. We know that we need food to grow, both for our bodies and for our minds. But being media literate, knowing that we have to pay for our content, doesn't do us any good if we don't have the means to do so. If I tell you you need more kale in your diet, it doesn't do any good if no one can afford to grow that kale. So what I'm asking you in the end today is to think about your local news the way you think about your local farmer's market. The more you support them, the more they'll be able to offer you, and the better you'll eat. I hope that is some food for thought. Thank you.